Well, it's Friday. Time to play some Valis 3. Again. Or something. I don't know. Pretend you didn't see this coming. It's Valis III, released in 1990 for PC Engine Super CD-ROM, courtesy of Telnet and Lasersoft, and years after only having what I was told was a lesser Mega Drive version to pique my interest in the series as a whole, before the pricing for the software and hardware required to run these things unpeaked it fairly quickly, I finally get to play the CD version it's based on and see how much better it is. Spoiler alert, it has more levels, it has more talkie bits, but it's more or less the same game, not that big of a deal. And to prove how not that big of a deal it really is, I'm going to recycle the next minute or so worth of audio from last Friday's video and dump it into this one because it's all pretty much the same deal. Have fun. Right, so to make a long story, well, less long, schoolgirl Yuko is chosen to be the wielder of the Valis sword, which is used to defend the Earth, Spirit, and Dream realms from evil forces. The game proper then starts off with Yuko in bed. Yes, naturally. While some other magical girl steals Valis, and so we play the opening stage in our pajamas because sure, why not? Fortunately, this doesn't last long since we are quickly introduced to our main villain for the chapter, we eventually get the sword back, transform into our magical bikini, and finally we can get this show on the road. Your arsenal of moves are straightforward. You have a sword attack that can shoot an energy wave that covers a short distance, but as you collect power-ups to increase your charge meter, your waves can travel a little farther provided you have available charge. You also have elemental wands that act like the Castlevania sub-weapons, up an attack to execute. Yuko has a high jump to reach higher ground, but this can be unwieldy at times. Finally, you have a slide attack that is quite versatile in application. Obviously, you can use it to slide through narrow passages and even as a quick attack, but it can also be used to slide across narrow passages between platforms, which is useful in places where jumping doesn't quite work out. As you progress through the game, Yuko will be joined by two other characters. Cham, the horned girl who's first seen stealing your sword, joins in the second stage and uses a whip as her main weapon. You know, just in case it isn't readily apparent what game serves as a partial source of inspiration. And you'll eventually be joined by Valna, who uses her magic wand to shoot projectiles that can be subsequently powered up. The game employs a swapping mechanic where you can switch characters on the fly, though there are certain segments of the game where only one heroine is allowed to proceed.
Everybody got that? Good!
So the CD version of Valis 3 had levels that were omitted from the Mega Drive release, and I say omitted because that's the proper term in this case. Memory limitations, that sort of thing being the main reason, but the other reason being, look, other than the graveyard stage, which I think was one of the better looking set pieces that I kinda wish made the cut, the other stages are kinda sort of bland, and the one part where you're needing an ice spell to freeze enemies and using them as temporary platforms, and that's assuming you have an ice spell on hand because item drops are more often than not randomized. Yeah, you could say some levels didn't make the cut, but I wouldn't call them missing either. Other than that though, Valis 3 on PC Engine plays a touch quicker compared to the Mega Drive port, which admittedly played a bit sluggishly at times. The ascent up the tower in the third act, I believe, is a perfect example, where on Genesis it felt like a bit of a sloth, but on the CD version it goes by fairly quickly. Some boss fights feel a bit simpler here compared to the cartridge version, but others still prove to be a hassle. And what doesn't help is that you cannot swap characters during a boss fight, and if you die, you sometimes respawn in the boss fight, which they fixed that in the Genesis port where you could respawn a little before the boss fight so you could at least swap characters. If only Valis 4 had been that diligent, but I digress. Control is fine for the most part. The jumping is still a bit stiff and the high jump doesn't feel quite as high or responsive for that matter, but other than that, it's generally responsive enough and swapping between characters is a bit more fluid here. Valis 3 does include a save feature that lets you save your progress, a feature that you'll never use if you're playing this through modern collections because save states and shit. Anyway, CD quality game means CD quality improvements, which doesn't always translate visually. Now the cutscenes are nicer here, obviously, but the cutscenes are nicer in all the Valis CD games, that goes without saying. Visually, Valis 3 sports some nicer looking sprite work in some aspects, some nicer colors here and there, but the backgrounds are kinda hit and miss. The cityscape on the CD version looks ugly as sin, and you toss it that red flash every so often. Meh. Also, Mega Drive has some parallax scrolling, which makes the boat ride to the tower look pretty sweet, whereas the CD version is just kinda, sort of, again, meh. Again, I do like the graveyard stage, I think that's a nice set piece, but then you have the desert at night, which is decidedly less so. You see kids, not everything is always better on CD-ROM. For example, one of the advantages of playing this Valis collection is the omission of the unspoken caveat of these CD games: excruciatingly long load times. On the bright side, however, the audio is considerably enhanced, both in terms of going from cartridge to CD, but also an upgrade over Valis II. Most notably, you've got a better selection of tunes that sound much more upbeat, energetic, and generally much more catchy melodies. It's Redbook audio, so after a few minutes the game will pause momentarily before restarting the track, which is a thing that happens, unfortunately. Sound effects are kinda meh, but that's nothing new. The voice acting is top-notch stuff, even if I don't understand a lick of Japanese, but that's okay. Overall, Valis III on PC Engine is a damned fine game. A considerable improvement over its predecessor, and, if I may be bold here, it's probably the best Valis game out of the bunch. Does it have its quirks that knocks the package down a peg or two? Sure it does. But you've got some fun characters to play with, the levels are generally pretty solid, the storyline is actually quite compelling in its own way, and the overall presentation is top-notch stuff. Now some could make the argument that Valis IV is probably the actual high point of the series, and we'll get to that eventually, but I just think that Valis III is the better game overall. In any case, it's well worth checking out in some form or fashion.